Hi, everyone, and welcome to Pathfinder, a podcast by Payload, the leading digital media company in the space industry. I'm your host, Mo Islam, and for the first time, we have 2 Pathfinder episodes in 1 week. We're excited to host a special one-off episode brought to you by our friends at Astroscale US, the Denver-based U.S. subsidiary of Astroscale, which is a global provider of on-orbit servicing solutions. Our episode today explores the DoD's push to integrate commercial in-space servicing, or ISAM, capabilities to enhance flexibility, resilience, and sustainability in military space operations. Joining us will be retired Colonel Dennis Wille, Senior Director of Business Development for National Security at Astroscale US, and John Patsy Klein, an expert in space policy and strategy, to discuss how commercial ISAM capabilities are transforming national security and advancing U.S. leadership in space. A brief note, the comments and opinions expressed by Patsy are solely his own. Let's get started. Patsy, Dennis, welcome to the show.
Great to be here. Thanks, Mo.
I appreciate the opportunity.
So maybe just to kick things off, why don't we just do a quick round of introductions? So Patsy, why don't we start with you? Tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we'll move on to Dennis.
Great. So name's John Klein. I go by Patsy, which is my call sign from my Navy days after Patsy Klein, the country music singer, if you know your country music from the 1950s and 60s. I'm a senior fellow and strategist with Falcon Research. I'm also adjunct professor at George Washington University Space Policy Institute and Georgetown University with their security studies program. I like to write books, which is a bad habit. I have the recently updated Space Warfare Strategy, Principles, and Policies, which came out a couple of weeks ago.
And Dennis?
So thanks for this opportunity to sit down together. My name is Dennis Wille. I am a recently retired Army colonel, and for the better part of 2/3 of my career, I was an Army space officer. I finished my career as the person in the Pentagon representing United States Space Command and led our Washington Liaison Office. Also spent a bunch of time being the Chief of Legislative Affairs for Space Command, and that was definitely a very interesting experience. I retired at the end of May and joined Astroscale US and have really enjoyed being a part of their business development team and helping Astroscale and the U.S. Space Force in particular understand how we can support them in on-orbit servicing.
Dennis, maybe why don't we kick things off with you? Tell us a little bit about Astroscale, maybe some of the history. I know it's a Tokyo-based company, but of course you're on the U.S. side. Tell us a little bit about the business, what you guys do.
Sure. I often talk about the origin story that I have personally with Astroscale and how in 2019, General Raymond, who was my boss at the time, said, I need to talk to staffers about space traffic management. And as an Army space officer, I didn't have a lot of background in space traffic management, so I did my research to go find out what it is. And eventually that helped me understand that space debris is a big part of space traffic management. And the expert in DC about space debris at the time on the private sector side was Charity Whedon, who was one of the original Astroscale US employees. And so, and then in short, she helped me understand that large pieces of debris turn into small pieces of debris, and that's not good for anybody. And it leads me very quickly to my statement that in the Army, especially in the Tank Corps, which I was a part of, there's no such thing as a friendly minefield. And in space, there is no such thing as friendly debris. And so I think that dynamic, that understanding is something that I've helped bring to this company. I hope to use as many tank references as possible today because I spent the first 10 years of my Army career as a tank officer.
So I know we're going to spend a lot of this episode talking about ISAM. So maybe why don't we start with what is that and why it's become a focal point for the DoD's commercial space integration strategy?
Sure. So ISAM, and I will be honest, there are a lot of acronyms to represent this particular part of the space ecosystem. I believe you're referring to in-space assembly and manufacturing, or another shorter or different version, in-space servicing, assembly, and manufacturing. And so at the end of the day, all of these types of servicing missions are intended to ultimately provide new options to spacecraft operators that they've never had in the past. I talk a lot about how we've engineered spacecraft to stare at the Earth with their payloads in stable orbits and never be touched. And, we're going to set aside human spaceflight because we've done rendezvous proximity operations and docking with the ISS and the shuttle for decades now. But when it comes to two smaller spacecraft, especially spacecraft that in the world of national security, that, oh my goodness, why would you ever want to touch my valuable, exquisite spacecraft with your spacecraft? There is a trust and confidence. I'm going to call it a problem. It's an opportunity for us to prove out that we in the ISAM community, not just Astroscale, are here to support and make operations in space better and not to do any harm. But at the, in the grand scale, ISAM technologies and mission area, the whole mission area is about extending the architecture of sustaining spacecraft, not just, from the launch pad, but into space itself.
And Patsy, why don't we talk a little bit about some of the work that you've done in helping influence, the integration of commercial capabilities, specifically in the case of ISAM.
Happy to. And just a point on Dennis, if he's going to do tank references, I'm going to do naval aviation references too. So I think we'll have enough equal opportunity on that. But thanks for the question on. So for the last 20 years, like you're saying, I've been writing about what space power theory is, what space strategy is, and I'll use my hands here since we have a camera. Strategy is about balancing ends and means. So you may have your political aims or your ends of what you want to achieve. Clausewitz talks about, the aims of policy, but your means to achieve it is the other side. And countries, or whether they're emerging, medium, or great powers, have to balance their ends and means to make sure that they're aligned. Commercial capabilities are key to that. If you look at the recent graphs of the number of spacecraft on orbit, we're in the thousands. A lot of those are SpaceX's Starlink right now. The number of space launches that are being provided, it's just ramping up really quickly. So we know commercial capabilities and services are important. They're important for how countries achieve their national strategies, their political aims. So that's my niche, and it's been intriguing for me because the technology always changes. I'm very fortunate in my day job, and for the disclaimer, the views expressed are my own. But I've had a chance to help inform the 2020 National Space Policy, the 2021 National Space Priorities Framework, National Defense Strategy, and then you did mention the DoD Commercial Space Integration Strategy. There's a companion strategy, which is the Space Force's Commercial Space Strategy, that kind of dovetails into that DoD one. But commercial are all very key parts of that, whether it's for providing capabilities, but it's also part of deterrence, because we need commercial launch to get spacecraft to orbit. We need commercial for satellite communications, Earth observation, and the like. So how do these capabilities help deter would-be rivals, whether it's deterrence through punishment or deterrence by denial of benefit? I find the area fascinating, and I'll be happy to talk for the next few hours about that.
Well, I wish we had a few hours to talk about it. Why don't we actually just take a step back for either of you guys? Maybe let's just do a little bit of defining what is the DoD's commercial space integration strategy.
So I'll take a first swag. It's at the departmental level. It's basically a few pages that kind of lays out the argument of why space is important. It uses some mission areas, that one being ISAM, that Dennis laid out previously using that definition, and that's one of the impetus for why we're talking today. But it's basically saying why commercial is important. And it's trying to talk through hey, here are some areas for further exploration. Here are some areas where we see commercial being the lead, or some areas where, hey, we're not there yet, but maybe these areas are more inherently governmental.
I want to add also to these strategies, and one of the things that Patsy just reminded me of is the balance between ends and means. When you talk about ways, there's different ways that you can sustain your fielded force in all of the physical domains. And, many people point to the logisticians as the folks that win the wars, because in order for, especially from the U.S. perspective, always hoping to fight an away game, you have to sustain your fielded force away from the continental United States. And the amateur historian in me sometimes likes to talk about how the science of war is sometimes about how many horses you have to feed in order to go from your base of operations to your limit of advance. In space, there's probably a version of that, and it's called the finite amount of gas in a particular type of spacecraft, and that its limit of advance is until that fuel tank is empty. So it's about ISAM, I think, at the highest level is about giving options to sustain the fielded force in space.
So why don't we touch on that a little bit more? So I'd love to chat a little bit more about the specific challenges in space operations that ISAM solves. Obviously, you just mentioned one of them, which is fuel, but it's fuel, it's other extension services. Like, what are you guys prioritizing at Astroscale?
So at Astroscale, I will talk about the spectrum of on-orbit servicing, or ISAM, that on one end, the more complicated end, is the debris removal type of missions. That, building a spacecraft that can chase down a tumbling piece of debris and then attach to it is probably one of the more complicated things that the engineers have to solve. It's not prepared, because usually the things that are debris today weren't engineered to be touched. And so it is an unprepared object. And because it's tumbling, we consider that uncooperative, which means you have to figure out a way to match its tumble and then attach to it without making it worse. So in debris removal, definitely at the high end of what we should be focusing on. But then as you go down that spectrum towards the other end is inspection. I don't have to touch your spacecraft in order to be able to service it. Providing images of the exterior of your spacecraft, or if there are other sensors that need to be added to a spacecraft to be able to provide a survey or an inspection, that's something that we can do today. And Astroscale is very proud of the ADRAS-J mission, ADRAS-J. This past summer, there was video all over YouTube of the 50-meter fly around of a tumbling piece of Japanese space agency debris. And so that is something that we focus on heavily right now, is how can we help customers inspect their own spacecraft after they are already on orbit. In between those two parts of the spectrum, you have things like assisted station keeping, sometimes referred to as enhanced maneuver, or augmented maneuver. And then augmented maneuver would be the station keeping. If I grabbed a hold of a spacecraft and changed its orbit to something entirely different, that would be enhanced maneuver. Second tank reference is that when I would take my tank platoon to the gunnery range, I wouldn't drive the tank that burned JP8 fuel at 2.5 gallons per mile. I would load it onto a flatbed, and then the truck driver would drive that very exquisite piece of machinery and save the fuel to go do the mission that it was designed to do. We see solutions in the future where exquisite national defense spacecraft are on board. Someone would call it a mothership or some other tug type reference. And then at a time and place of the government's choosing, the exquisite spacecraft can separate and go do its mission with all of the Delta V that it's been allowed to keep on board, and then get back on board and get replenished in the future. And that's where the refueling comes in, is that refueling definitely is an interaction that is still something that we're all working on from a technological perspective. But for sure, there are mission areas in space today where the operators absolutely wish that they weren't having to conserve their fuel first, but could actually go do the mission that they were told to go do by their chain of command. That, if we're going to spend time doing neighborhood watch, then we should probably be measuring success in number of sorties per spacecraft versus how much Delta V did I burn today.
So, I completely buy actually, your tank analogy was actually quite helpful and valuable. So I understand the need for conserving fuel and positioning spacecraft in a way that could help it be more performative and efficient. I am curious, why does the government care about debris removal?
In the past, we mitigated debris specifically in GEO by moving spacecraft that were at the end of their life to the graveyard belt. Nothing's in the graveyard belt until there is, of course. And I think the debris problem starts to become more apparent when we've saturated low Earth orbits with thousands of spacecraft in a way where a handful that are non-functioning, can we wait for the sun to be in the atmosphere to force a low Earth orbit deorbit, or do we need to purposely have those removed from their planes so that they can be replaced? These are operational questions that I know that the national security community has started to look at. It doesn't mean that the government has to be the trash collectors, but at the end of the day, there are risks for large pieces of debris turning into small pieces of debris in all orbits. And I think that our government should be interested in ensuring that that risk is mitigated as much as possible.
Patsy, why don't you, and Dennis, thank you, that's helpful. Patsy, maybe tell us a little bit about why these capabilities allow us to maintain leadership in space.
Excellent. So I'm going to just double down on a point that Dennis made, and maybe a mixed metaphor or two. So, you mentioned ISAM being in space servicing, assembly, and manufacturing. DoD does love their acronyms. I know they get kind of you can get kind of tongue tied depending on which strategy you look like. But if I could rephrase the S to be the Swiss Army knife of missions. So we're looking for multi-mission capabilities, things that you really can't predict. But Dennis was emphasizing refueling, but it's potentially moving satellites around via tug, its inspection, maybe repair, maybe life extension. Maybe we're going to swap out components, and then the active debris removal. So why? You asked why should the U.S. government or DoD care about active debris removal? The mission that Astroscale is taking on fully. So in my writing, I usually use a maritime analogy, and through analogy, the purpose of space strategy is to ensure access to and use of space, and it's in the ensuring the use of space. In land warfare, if your rival or your adversary lays out anti-personnel mines, you have folks who go up and clean up those mines, who have very dangerous work. There's been movies about that. In the maritime domain, if your rival mines ports, you have mine sweeping capability. Open water mines are forbidden per the law of war because they're indiscriminate obstacles. But we know based on international treaty and customary international law that certain types of weapons or capabilities you should not have. So anything that's an indiscriminate obstacle that can affect those that are in the military or civilians or commercial capabilities, you need to have a way to address that. And to me, that's the easy sell for active debris removal. Just like the Navy needs minesweepers, the U.S. Space Force needs a way to clean up things that impinge their ability to do their operations or it affects commerce and trade. Just to the point on the different usage in the U.S. Space Force's commercial space strategy, unfortunately, they don't use ISAM, but they use a kind of a equivalent that may kind of makes sense based on Dennis's comments. It's space access, mobility, and logistics. So again, it's back to that logistics and mobility piece, movement and maneuver, sustainability, recovery, all those things. But all military services care about that. And I think that's where active debris removal fits in.
Dennis, I'm curious, how do you think about the relatively recently announced PLEO, Proliferated Low Earth Orbit strategy program, obviously focus the DoD has? I think it's like a $13 billion spend, at least announced spend. I'm kind of curious, do you think about that and sort of think cha-ching, that's a lot of satellites that need servicing and refueling. But actually, all jokes aside, like how do you think about that opportunity near term versus long term? Obviously, a lot of these are newer assets that are going up into space that are not going to need immediate servicing. But how do you think about sort of what is the commercial opportunity today, or the opportunity today with the government versus what it looks like over the next 5 to 10 years?
Sure. I think obviously with that dollar amount, there's a lot of different people that are trying to make sure that they can figure out how to be involved. I go back to the concepts of prepared versus unprepared. In low Earth orbit, a lot of the use cases for servicing aren't as strong, simply because when you're launching things into low Earth orbit, there is a basic assumption that its lifespan does not need to be nearly as long as GEO or HEO, simply because the energy needed to get to LEO is less than the energy needed to get further out beyond the gravity well. And so there are a lot of people right now who are arguing that there's no reason to do any sort of servicing. I go back to the discussion I had a little bit ago about when you put not just a handful, but hundreds of satellites in a single plane in order to do its mission. And some of them stop working for whatever reason, whether it died of natural causes or it was purposely bricked by an adversary. In order to ensure that you can reconstitute your fielded force in space, you also have to do what in the Army tank reference, or Army reference number 3 is recovery and reconstitution. And so we built recovery vehicles. I'm not sure that there's an actual Army requirement. I'd have to go look that up. But, a big R requirement for the wheeled and tracked recovery vehicles, but we have them in the Army. And we use them because after a battle, we have to go and reconstitute that fielded force for the next battle. And so if the assumption within our national security circles is that no matter what happens to the low Earth orbit spacecraft, we're just going to let the atmosphere and the sun do the job, then I think that's an area where we can spend more time thinking about other options to be able to do the recovery and reconstitution. Patsy talked a little bit earlier about repair. When you can attach yourself to a prepared satellite and move it to a place where you can repurpose that mass instead of having to just launch the equivalent amount of mass, I think that is something that we should be looking into so that we can provide those types of future options for our military commanders.
So I actually want to talk a little bit about one of the priorities that sits within the Space Force, which is tactically responsive space. And there's been a couple interesting missions that have gone quite well. I mean, particularly, the one that comes to mind is the 24-hour turnaround with the Firefly launch, the Victus Nox mission, which was a success for the DoD. I'm kind of curious, like, what is sort of the vision within ISAM of maybe something that's like, is there sort of an equivalent, as there is in launch, an equivalent within ISAM, which is like, hey, we want the capability to repair, refuel, move a asset in space within a very, very short amount of time. Obviously, that's, we can think of a lot of reasons why that would be the case, or that could be the case, but maybe talk a little bit about, what might be some of the technologies that maybe Dennis, you can talk about Astroscale's working on, or Patsy, so more strategic items that's on the DoD's mind.
I'll go first and talk about pre-positioning and how, like I said earlier, if launch is your only method of replenishment and sustainment, launching something that is pre-positioned means that you can use it at a future date at a time and place of your choosing. I got introduced to the early days of tactically responsive space as a grad student a couple of decades ago when Admiral Sobrowski was the one who was pushing concepts like this. And at the time, we didn't have reusable launch vehicles. We didn't have very many small launch vehicles. And so it didn't seem like a very good way to do business because it was going to be expensive to just keep boosters and payloads in a warehouse for some future scenario. Today, we are almost doing tactically responsive space by default because of how frequently launches are taking place and how quickly Space Force is able to go and procure a new capability to be able to get into that low Earth orbit constellation. But in space, I think repair is something that is still coming down the road, simply because once you've swapped out a line replaceable unit, what do you do with the old one? It's now debris. At some point, you have to put it into the trash bag and wait for somebody to come along later to clean all that up. But definitely having things pre-positioned to go do national security missions is something that is a good way for ISAM to contribute.
So I'll just add a couple of things. When you first look at tactically responsive space, to me, or maybe for the casual observer, it's like, ISAMs, there's really not a big hook there. But if you look at the details of what they're actually describing, a lot of it has to do with movement and maneuver, dynamic space operations. So again, going back to that Swiss Army knife, that pickup truck capability that you have on orbit, any type of multi-mission capabilities that helps with dynamic space operations, refueling, life extension, whatever allows your satellites or spacecraft to perform to their best capability for as long as you can. I think that fits in tangentially. And if you also look at what the TAC RS was supposed to do, they also want to characterize potential new threats. So that's kind of beyond just launch in itself. It's on orbit capabilities that have space domain awareness. There's no reason why you couldn't have a hosted payload on an active debris removal satellite or some type of multi-mission satellite that does refueling. So there's a place there. It may not seem that obvious or intuitive, but I'm optimistic.
Dennis, maybe and you alluded to this a little bit by talking about sort of the repair example and the debris that might create. But what are sort of the most mature ISAM capabilities that we have today? Like, what are those capabilities that we have today? And then maybe tell us a little bit about what that looks like, the development looks like over the medium term of like what we will have relatively soon.
Sure. I think when it comes to maturity levels, I'm going to default back to inspection, simply because that has been demonstrated successfully. Astroscale has, with its Address J mission, made that a reality and pushed it into everybody's news feeds in the space community for a couple of weeks, and that was exciting. And that reminds me that when we talk about spacecraft that were engineered to never be touched, there's a bit of a trust and confidence opportunity that we have to provide. And I think from a maturity perspective, focusing on in military, we like to call it reps and sets, that the more often we can prove that these rendezvous proximity operations and attachment technologies work, then that's the focus right now. Is from a national security perspective, I know that our clients, the government, wants first and foremost that no harm is done to their very exquisite national security capabilities, and then once that trust has been built, I think that then we can start to progress towards more intricate things that you can do from an ISAM perspective.
And perhaps, along with inspection, we've seen some refueling going on in the geobelt. Some tug capability, so life extensions and refueling. I think that's an easy one. I'm really excited by once we get to some real debris removal capabilities, that's closer than we would think.
I'll also add really quickly that from a refueling perspective, we're working very hard on providing Space Force with a refueling spacecraft to make sure that the work that the Assured Access to Space Office is doing is successful.
Dennis, well, let's actually talk about a little bit more about the partnership between Astroscale and the DoD. Like, how much of that relationship is, someone saying to you, "Hey, we need this capability, deliver it to us by X date, if you can," and how much of it is like a partnership where it's like, "Hey, like let's work on this technology together," and what does that look like if that's the case?
It's a really great question. And I think one of the things that we've really put a lot of emphasis on within Astroscale is being the trusted partner that the DoD needs us to be. This is new, and yes, the industry is awesome, and we're going to go do great and innovative things. But without that partnership, where that trusted partnership, where our oversight is really focusing on a lot of the details for what we are providing them. This is not just, hey, we'll see you in a couple of years. There are frequent meetings all the time between the program managers and our engineers. And I was fortunate to have an opportunity to sit in on one of those meetings, and we talked about the protocols for the rendezvous proximity operations and all of the different things that are built into the decision making for what makes it a safe interaction. We want to be that trusted provider, that trusted servicing provider, and so we focus a lot on being successful, as every company does. There's not a single company that doesn't focus on its own success. We recognize that first time success is going to mean a lot to the national security community.
And I know we're spending a lot of time talking about the DoD as a customer, but Dennis, maybe briefly talk to me a little bit about, like, and you can answer it for Astroscale US or Astroscale as a whole. Looking forward, what does that mix look like between the government customer versus commercial customers? Do you see sort of near term it's going to be mainly government driven revenue and contracts? Do you see it as a mix? Do you see one side being more relevant than the other, at least in the near term?
That is definitely one of the challenges that I think a lot of companies like Astroscale are trying to sort through, is just how much is the initial streams of revenue going to come from the U.S. government or their own national governments, or versus the private sector. We hope that both of those streams move at an equal pace. I'm not going to call it a chicken and egg, but there are times where the government is waiting for the private sector to move, and the private sector is waiting for the government to move. And knowing that there are groups of acquisition professionals within the Space Force and also the intel community who are leaning into this is definitely encouraging.
Patsy, I want to direct this next one to you. So what do you think are the policy or regulatory hurdles that are out there to kind of adopting ISAM technology at scale, both for military use cases and for actual commercial use cases? Why don't we start there?
The biggest thing is, ISAM is in the DoD commercial space integration strategy. We know that it's an important capability. We need to implement our strategies. That's the biggest one. We don't need another study, a study of studies, and the like. We just need to get down to it, and we need to incentivize those commercial capabilities and services that we want. Sometimes that means steady funding. That means DoD, Space Force communicating, hey, here's an important capability. I want to make sure I have access to all the orbits that are important to me, and I want to fund a capability that does active debris removal, refueling, inspection, whatever it is. This is important. Let's partner with industry. Let's incentivize. Let's share the risk, and let's move forward. So we don't need another document. I love writing strategies, but we don't need that now. We need to actually implement as far as programs. And the other thing is, we need to make sure that we have a permissive regulatory regime. The U.S. is very blessed that we do have overall a very permissive regulatory regime. We want to make sure that U.S. companies, U.S. subsidiaries stay U.S. and we don't push them elsewhere. So we got to make sure that there's opportunities for Astroscale and other companies to actually work on these novel emerging technologies to fit into our national security architecture.
I'm curious, Patsy, this one's for you. So your example around removing the minefields removing the mines from the minefield make a lot of sense. Obviously, we don't want our assets to be blown up or crash into things that that otherwise we could have removed. What do you think it will take? And do you think it's a policy change or regulatory change for it to take for the commercial industry to actually, because, oftentimes it will easily be a commercial piece of debris that the DoD then has to pay for to get removed. What do you think it will take for the commercial industry to start becoming a much bigger part of, for example, Astroscale's business when it comes to like orbital debris removal? Do you think it's going to take an unfortunate, to see a really sizable like asset loss, or even worse, like loss of life because of some debris issue, for it to be taken much more seriously than it is today? I mean, maybe talk, maybe, yeah, tell us a little about that.
Well, it's a wonderful question because in the U.S., policy usually lags real world events. Usually, we have to wait for something catastrophic to happen before we update policies, whether it's making it more restrictive or more sustainable in this regard. So I would say, unfortunately, probably something's going to happen, but we know the big questions and we can be ready with sound answers or solutions to those. For the active debris removal, for the mine sweeping example, there's no commercial market for that right now, right? I mean, there's going to be a DoD or the U.S. government. Hey, I'm willing to pay for it. So it's more of a government contractor relationship. But how do we take this capability and turn it into a commercial marketplace? And I think if you use the Swiss Army tool analogy, if you had multi-mission capabilities, you know, if we're doing refueling or life extension in geo, I do think these companies with the mega constellations are going to need some help if some of their satellites are in op, or potentially they got placed into the wrong orbit, threaten the space stations that are on orbit. So I think there's some there, and I'm hopeful in the next few years the commercial companies will see the benefit. And let's not forget about the underwriting industry, the insurance industry. Sometimes if you have sustainable practices, safe practices, maybe you'll get a discount on launch. Maybe you'll get a discount on your insurance policy to cover your spacecraft on orbit.
Is any of what we're talking about like potentially an education issue? Meaning, like, are there sort of misconceptions about the feasibility, cost effectiveness, readiness of ISAM technologies that prevent more defense or commercial applications in your mind? Neither of your minds?
To me, it's not an education issue. It's just purely a communicating. It's incentivizing. It's a funding issue. For the folks who need to know, they know the answer. Uh, Maybe we don't have the historical experience of a real combat in space to kind of see the mess this could be, and hopefully we never do. But I don't know if it's I don't think it's an education. It's more of a signaling funding issue to me.
I would agree with that. That you know, the Pentagon is always about budgets and priorities, and there's a lot of priorities that are out there. And in a brand new military service has been asked to do a lot in its first 5 years. So, you know, when it comes to the world of policy, show me your budget, and we'll be able to talk about what's the most important thing going on. I am thinking about you're talking about insurance and underwriting. There is definitely a point where I think some of these servicing technologies are going to kickstart conversations within those types of communities to better understand, potentially a inspection right upon deployment will help us better understand what that spacecraft is going to be able to do in the future. And even something as simple as putting onboard cameras on a spacecraft to be able to do self-inspection. And, you know, the more sensors that you have in space, the more data is generated, and then the more all of the spacecraft operators are going to be able to have trust and confidence in each other.
Dennis, what are some of the technical gaps or operational risks that need to be addressed for ISAM to be fully integrated into space architectures?
I think that one of the biggest technologies that we can start to incorporate are the simple things you can do to prepare your satellite for a physical interaction. Now, spacecraft operators are going to look at that and say, you've just added cost to my spacecraft that isn't required. And I think this gets back to the question Patsy addressed when it comes to policy lagging, is that there are times when our government has imposed certain risk mitigating activities on the land domain or the air domain or the maritime domain. And maybe maybe we're at a point where some of those risk mitigation technologies are imposed in different ways. But from a technological gap perspective, I really think that none of what we're talking about is science fiction, that there aren't any significantly new technologies that need to be pulled out of the lab. It really is about starting to move the TRL levels of the existing technologies up into the application and proven out that these things are working. We just haven't had a chance to do the demos yet.
That being said, I do have to ask, are there any technological advancements within the field that we should anticipate over the next decade that could be substantial drivers of demand?
In the dream world that I have every now and then, where I'm a 100% optimist, and I'm not talking about 5 to 10 years from now, in 5 to 10 years, I see some of the repurposing of mass on orbit to go, as some companies out there call it, debris into delta V. That, if there is a lifeblood of maneuvering spacecraft, it's delta V. And so now you can have your favorite fuel, whether it's a chemical propulsion or electrical propulsion. Different people have different things that they want to see turned into reality. But if there is a point where we have successfully been able to take debris into one end of a large volume space and recycle it into something purposeful to be reused in space, we have now saved some of the tax of the gravity well for future capabilities. And so you talk about providing options to military commanders. If you don't have to launch something and you're kicking out new capability in space, that is something that I think every space military commander would want to have in their kit bag.
So perhaps we can, use some future technology to transform a piece of debris into some type of offensive kinetic capability. I'm kidding. We don't need to talk about that. But actually, what I did want to say, so Dennis, you bring up a very interesting example, which is like repurposing mass. You also alluded to a little bit about how that could change, potentially like be additive to defense strategies. But Patsy, maybe you can go a little deeper on that point. Like, what do you think these advancements in ISAM will open up in terms of our defense strategies in space?
For the technology that I have the most hope for, whether we know inspection and other things are coming along, the propulsive technologies, what we've seen for movement and maneuver, dynamic space operations. 20 years ago, we weren't talking about some of the capabilities that we're seeing in an open source environment, especially from some of the U.S. rivals. So I think that's going to change a lot. But I'll go back to the fundamentals of the purpose of space strategy is to ensure access to and use of space. Access is probably most of our launch capabilities. It can be TAC RS, but it's the use. We know there's going to be competition. There's already crisis and competition going on in the space domain. So how do we make sure we can use space for national security purposes? And that's where companies like Astroscale, other emerging technology is important to ensure that we can remove the debris, have lots of capabilities, maybe some capabilities we haven't even talked about. Maybe they're just hosted. But I think that's the role. And I just want to bring up one quick sea story. An unnamed 4-star general early on in the Space Force, was at a breakfast with him. I said, General, is there an operational requirement for U.S. Space Command to be able to remove debris that's acting as an indiscriminate obstacle. Again, back to that land warfare, maritime domain analogy. And he looks over to his aide, says, well, the technology does not exist, so no. But that's not the way it works. So if there's an operational requirement, if there's a need, communicate that to commercial companies and see if they have the technology to kind of figure out what that need is. And I think that's where companies like Astroscale can play.
Dennis, it would be great, especially for you, if Astroscale was the only player focused on this and working with the DoD on this. But maybe talk to us a little bit about how you position yourself versus competitors. There's other startups out there building technology. There's existing primes that have extension capabilities. Maybe tell us a little bit about how you position yourself versus what's out there.
A really great question. I'm not going to give away all of the company secrets, but it is definitely something that in my short time in being in Astroscale, I keep learning about more and more companies announcing themselves as ISAM related companies. And so you ask yourself, how can all of these different companies navigate the competition that's there? I go back to the trust and confidence conversation that first, we recognize that we're not trying to go faster than we need to. We're not looking to overpromise anything that someone is overpromising. We want to make sure that our customers know exactly what they're getting when they're in conversation with us, and recognize that Astroscale has, in its time, from its inception more than 10 years ago, has built a really nice brand. And at the end of the day, we know that success in space is definitely on brand, and that you can continue to build trust and confidence within the entire community. I really do think that this whole conversation about ISAM is representative of a proverbial paradigm shift in how space operators are going to engineer their spacecraft, design their lives, and there will be a point, and this is where Astroscale can continue to be a leader in the conversation, where we are coming up with solutions that hadn't even been thought of yet. And that's what happens when you focus on building an economy. The amateur historian in me likes to think back to the 1920s, when the U.S. Postal Service decided to start moving mail around the country with this new thing called an airplane. And suddenly you had airfields and air traffic controllers and all sorts of infrastructure being built because it was changing everything. And you could even go back throughout our history where not just the U.S. government, but the U.S. military was central to building new economies. And so deviate a little bit from the question that you asked, but it's about, Astroscale helping that conversation along in a trusted way.
No, I think it's an important point because, Patsy, I want to ask you, what advice do you give industry stakeholders who are interested in supporting national security through ISAM? What are some general pieces of advice that you want to give to those folks?
Be patient. So, the DoD, I would say all military services, they have an acquisition structure or program protocol, the 5000 series, the FAR. It can be cumbersome. There is some moves to make things quicker, but sometimes the government is unsure in what they want. They're not very good at communicating, even though they're well intentioned. So I think we're okay. I know if you read what U.S. rivals like Russia and China are doing, they would gladly trade places with the U.S. with its commercial sector. So before we beat each other up on what we're not doing enough, we're doing a lot right, but we can be move quicker, be more transparent, and just kind of have an open dialogue. Maybe remind government what they say that they wanted and say, hey, here's a potential solution. And maybe, a lot of commercial companies have folks on the Hill that help get the legislation in line to help these programs move along too. But patience, and remind the government that they need to implement what they say.
And since I have both of you guys here, I do have a bit of a general question that I want to get both your perspectives on. We're obviously spending a lot of time here talking about ISAM and the DoD and strategy. Um, Patsy, to your earlier point, we have adversaries out there who are not as advanced as we are, but are obviously moving very quickly and closing that gap a lot quicker than we would have thought even 5-10 years ago that they could. I am kind of curious, general question: how do you think that the U.S. can maintain its leadership role in space, while at the same time, obviously, fostering a more sustainable environment and being responsible in space operations? We've seen a number of different occasions where our adversaries have not been very sustainable or responsible when they put things up into space. But how can we do that, but also achieve and maintain or continue to maintain our leadership?
I know it's kind of in the news lately, but the biggest thing is having a very permissive regulatory and licensing regime. Uh, the licensing process for a lot of space companies is very cumbersome. Launch, you'll go through FAA. If you're communications, you'll go through the FCC. If you're Earth observation, you'll go through NOAA. So it's not the easiest thing for commercial operators to get the licensing, but we want U.S. companies to stay U.S. And I will say, despite our rivals stealing our intellectual property, our technology, whatever it takes, we're still out in front. I've been doing this for a few years now, and our rivals are only 5 years away, and 20 years later they're 5 years away. I know there's folks who talk about the kill chain and elsewhere, but I think we're okay. But we need to make sure. I was talking to a friend who worked at the Department of Commerce, Office of Space Commerce, and her comment was unleash the power of commercial, kind of like unleash the Kraken. So let the commercial operators do what they do best and get out of their way, and you'll be surprised what U.S. companies can do.
Dennis, do you have any thoughts here?
I think that Patsy nailed it on that one. That
Release the Kraken.
Yes. Thank you for that maritime reference as well.
Well, I appreciate both of you guys taking the time to do this today. Just to kind of end here, maybe we can kind of go around the horn. Before we started the podcast, Patsy and I were talking about books and books that we've been reading, and we very quickly got into depressive discussions about nuclear technology. But I am kind of curious, both Patsy and Dennis, anything you're reading right now, or any favorites that you have that you would want to recommend to folks listening?
Yeah, I think we talked about what I'm currently reading. I am reading The Kill Chain, finally getting around to that. It's some good, solid arguments. And then Ender's Game. I didn't think it just kept on popping up. So I thought I'd finally get around saying, why are grown adults still talking about this book, and that it's a must read?
Yeah, apparently it's. I'm very curious because you mentioned it teaches you a lot about leadership. So I'm actually I've never read or watched Ender's Game, but you've definitely given me a good reason to do it.
Well, I'm told the book, not the movie. So that's what I heard from multiple sources.
Okay, book, not the movie. Dennis?
Yeah, I also read Ender's Game much later in my career after having it been recommended to me than I should have. So the books that I wish I got royalties after I recommended, besides Patsy's book about irregular warfare in space, which, by the way, if you're looking to really wrap your head around ways of doing national security in space other than just building a really big army, he's got a lot of good suggestions in his book, and a great framework for understanding how these solutions can be applied. But in my own personal library of things that I have been recommending, it's the books Delta V and Critical Mass, and written by Daniel Suarez, Silicon Valley guy, and it's the basic premise of the book is, in order for us to overcome the tax that we spend on launching things out of the gravity well, we really just need to send a human crew out to an asteroid and mine it, and then for a small amount of Delta V, push that thousands of metric tons worth of usable material back to the Earth Moon system. I learned more about where the industry is likely headed in the next couple of decades from those books than I did from much of what I hear from government or industry itself. And so it's not a perfect solution for everything, but one of the best parts of those books is the fact that it brings in the licensing and the legal aspects of it and the financing and a lot of solutions that we have to figure out in order for us to start to have an in-space economy, not just a space-enabled economy.
That's a strong endorsement. I'm going to have to check that out myself. By the way, on a completely different note, I need to bring this up because it's very top of mind. Have either of you seen the movie Interstellar?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
So
Interstellar, I think because it's the 10th anniversary, which is crazy. I feel pretty old because I feel like that movie came out just like yesterday. Interstellar is being re-released in theaters in New York and maybe elsewhere. I don't know, but I know specifically in New York on Friday, on the 6th. And it is being released in IMAX 70 millimeter, which I'm not a movie buff, but apparently it's like the best way you can watch IMAX. I think it was in theaters for 7 days. All every show has been sold out, and the tickets are actually selling in the secondary market for like north of $250, which is crazy. So it's kind of interesting. Like, and I bring this example up because one, it's like awesome to see like how much demand there is for like, a space based. I mean, it's a great movie, regardless of the fact that it's Christopher Nolan's probably best work. But it's just it's just like another data point to me because I see so much more interest in what is happening in the industry, so much more than I ever have, and it's just and maybe. And it's very possible that I'm biased because, it's kind of like one of those things where like when someone points out a Volkswagen Beetle, you like see it everywhere, right? It's just like one of those things where it's just like maybe there's like this inherent psychological bias. But I just feel like the level of public interest in space and space technology is the highest I've seen it, at least since the Apollo era. I don't know if you guys have seen that, but it's just kind of an exciting time to be doing the work that we're all doing.
One of my working theories is that the human spaceflight program is probably the best advertisement for just about everything that does go on, because the storytelling that can go on is really great. Now, NASA has figured out how to humanize rovers on another planet and turn those into very compelling stories as well. And so I'm really interested in watching the race of the commercial LEO destination programs get off the ground, literally. And that because that is the continuation of the human storytelling that will go on in space. Now, we all got excited when Address J did its fly around, but didn't. But it's not still there. And then we definitely got superseded by two very large chopsticks grabbing a skyscraper as it came back towards Earth. So I think you're right. I think that the interest in space continues to be there and continue to grow. Definitely when we start getting humans beyond low Earth orbit again, that's going to really, really get things going again.
Yeah, look, ultimately it's only going to be good things for us, right? You have more people out there who are interested, more younger folks who are interested, who, as they get older, they decide to have careers in space, whether it's on the defense side or the commercial side. Obviously, more talent is what we need. So anyway, Patsy, Dennis, thanks so much for being with us today. This is a pleasure, and looking forward to having you guys back in the future. So thank you.
Thanks, Mo.
Yep. Have a great day.